Be quiet. This is for successful people to discuss. Those were the exact words my son, Brian, shouted at me that Friday afternoon, while he was arguing with his wife about selling my house. I was standing in the doorway of the living room, still wearing my apron, holding a dish towel in my hands. I had just come in to ask if they wanted coffee. And instead of an answer, I got that. A yell, a command, a dismissal so profound I felt something break inside me. Brian didn't even look at me when he said it. His eyes were fixed on his wife, who was sitting on my couch with her arms crossed, and that look of annoyance she always wore when I entered the room. They were talking about numbers, deadlines, real estate agents, about my house. As if I wasn't even there. As if my opinion didn't matter. I froze for a moment. My legs were shaking, but not from fear. It was something deeper. It was the feeling of being erased, of having ceased to exist as a person and instead become a problem that needed to be solved. My 69 years of life reduced to an obstacle between them and the money they could get from selling the only place I could still call my own. I didn't say anything. I just turned around and walked slowly to my bedroom. I heard their voices behind me, but I wasn't paying attention to the words anymore. It was a constant murmur, background noise. Like when the television is left on in an empty room, I closed my bedroom door gently. I didn't want them to hear the click of the latch. I didn't want them to know that something in me had just changed. I sat on the edge of the bed, the same bed I shared with my husband for over 30 years, and took a deep breath. My hands were trembling as I opened the nightstand drawer. There it was, the small black notebook where I kept the important numbers. I turned the pages slowly until I found the one I was looking for. A name, a phone number, a person I hadn't seen in years, but who had told me once, "If you ever need me, don't hesitate to call." I dialed. The ring sounded slow, eternal. 1, 2, 3, and then I heard his voice on the other end. Calm, professional. "Mrs. Davis, it's been a long time." I didn't cry. My voice came out firm, clear. I explained in a few words what was happening. What they had just said to me, what they were planning to do with my house, with my life. He listened in silence, and when I finished, he just said, "I'll be there in 10 minutes. Don't worry about a thing." I hung up the phone and left it on the bed. I felt a strange calm, as if after years of carrying everyone else's weight, I had finally given myself permission to fight back, to say enough, to remind them that I existed too. I got up and looked at myself in the dresser mirror. The woman looking back at me had gray hair pulled back in a low bun. She had wrinkles around her eyes. She had hands stained from a lifetime of work. But she also had something they had forgotten. She had dignity. And they weren't going to take that away from me. I left the room and walked back to the living room. Brian and his wife were still there, sitting on my couch, surrounded by papers and real estate brochures. They were talking about price per square foot, about trendy neighborhoods, about how much they could get if they sold quickly. They didn't even look up when I walked in. I sat in the armchair across from them, my hands folded in my lap. I watched them in silence. Brian gestured with his hands as he spoke, using that tone of voice he always used when he thought he was right. His wife nodded occasionally, typing something on her phone. Probably texting an agent, probably running the numbers. I thought about all the times I had opened the doors of this house to welcome them. All the meals I had prepared. All the nights I had stayed up watching their children when they wanted to go out. All the times I had said yes when I wanted to say no. All the times I had swallowed my pain so as not to inconvenience them. And now here they were, planning to sell my house as if it were a worthless object. As if the memories held within these walls meant nothing. As if I meant nothing. Brian finally looked at me. For a second, our eyes met. And I saw something in his gaze that broke my heart. There was no guilt, no hesitation, just impatience, annoyance. As if my presence were a nuisance holding him back from where he wanted to be. "Mom," he said, using the tone he used to talk to a small child. "We already talked about this. The house is too big for you. You can't maintain it alone. It's better to sell it now while the prices are good. You'll be better off in a smaller place. Simpler. Cheaper." his wife added without looking up from her phone. I didn't answer. I just looked at them. And in that silence, I think Brian sensed something. Something that made him frown. "Mom, are you okay?" His voice sounded annoyed, not worried. As if my silence were a tactic to make things difficult for him. Then the doorbell rang. The sound cut through the tension like lightning. Brian stood up with an exaggerated sigh. "Who is it now?" he muttered, walking to the door. His wife put her phone down and looked at me with that familiar expression of annoyance, as if everything I did was an inconvenience. I heard Brian open the door. I heard the formal greeting. "Good afternoon, Mr. Brian Davis." And then I heard the silence. That heavy silence that falls when someone realizes something is wrong. Brian came back into the living room, walking slowly. His face had changed. The confidence was gone. There was only confusion. Behind him came a man in his 50s, wearing a gray suit and a dark tie. He carried a leather briefcase in his hand and wore a serious but respectful expression. The man looked directly at me and nodded. "Mrs. Davis." His voice was calm, professional. I nodded back at him. Brian's wife stood up. "Who are you?" she asked, in that commanding tone she used to intimidate people. But the man ignored her. He kept looking at me, waiting for my response. "Shall we proceed, ma'am?" he asked. I nodded. "Yes, please." And that's when I saw Brian's face crumble. The confusion turned to panic. His eyes darted from the man to me, searching for an explanation. "Mom, what's going on here? Who is this person?" I didn't answer right away. I just looked at him. I looked at this man who had been my baby, who had slept in my arms, who had cried in my lap during nightmares, who had told me he loved me thousands of times, and who had just yelled at me to shut up because I wasn't important enough to have an opinion about my own life. "This," I said finally, my voice calm, "is Mr. Kaplan, my lawyer." The silence that followed was deafening. Brian's mouth opened, but no sound came out. His wife dropped her phone onto the couch. The lawyer calmly opened his briefcase and took out a folder full of documents. "Mrs. Davis," the lawyer said, looking at me with respect, "do you confirm that you wish to proceed with the eviction order and the legal review of all assets in your name?" "Yes," I replied. "I confirm." Brian took a step toward me. His voice was trembling. "Mom, no, you can't do this. We're family. You're not going to do this to us, are you?" And there it was, the word I had been waiting to hear for so long. Family. That word he had forgotten when he was planning to sell my house. That he had forgotten when he yelled at me to shut up. That he had forgotten every time he treated me like I was invisible. Family. That word sounded so empty on his lips. So desperate. So convenient, right at this moment. I stayed seated in my armchair, watching Brian as he tried to find something else to say. His eyes jumped from the lawyer to me, looking for an escape, looking for the crack where he could wedge in his usual excuses. But I was no longer the same woman I had been 10 minutes ago. Something had changed. Something had broken, and I had no intention of fixing it. Mr. Kaplan, the lawyer, sat in the chair by the window and began organizing the papers on the coffee table. His wife remained standing, arms crossed, looking at me with a mixture of rage and disbelief, as if I had committed some betrayal, as if defending what was mine was an act of war against them. While the lawyer reviewed the documents, my mind started to drift back, to all those moments I had tried to forget, to all those signs I had ignored because I wanted to believe my family loved me, that they needed me, that I mattered. I remembered my birthday 2 years ago, my 67th birthday. I had prepared a small dinner, nothing extravagant, just a roast chicken, a salad, and a chocolate cake I had spent all afternoon baking from scratch. I set the table with the embroidered tablecloth my mother had given me. I lit candles. I waited. Brian had called me 2 days earlier to confirm he was coming, that he'd be there at 7 o'clock in the evening with his wife and the kids. I spent the whole day cooking, cleaning, making sure everything was perfect. At 7 o'clock sharp, the table was set. At 7:30, I started to worry. At 8 o'clock, I called his phone. It went to voicemail. At 8:30, I called again. Nothing. At 9 o'clock, I got a text message. Short, cold, Sorry, Mom, something important came up. We'll make it up to you another time. Love you. I just sat there, in front of that table full of food that no one was going to eat, watching the candles slowly burn down, feeling something inside me extinguish along with them. The next day, I saw the pictures on social media. Brian, his wife, and the kids were at a fancy restaurant downtown, smiling, toasting, celebrating something. Whatever it was, anything was more important than their mother's birthday. When I asked him about it days later, he said it was a last-minute business dinner, that he hadn't been able to let me know sooner, that I should understand. And I, as always, understood. I swallowed my pain. I smiled. I told him it was no problem, that there would be other opportunities. But the other opportunities never came. I remembered last Christmas. Brian had promised they would come spend the afternoon with me, that we'd have dinner together, that the kids would open their presents here. In the house where their father grew up, I bought the gifts months in advance. I wrapped each one carefully. I made a ham, sweet potatoes, and Christmas cookies. The house smelled of cinnamon and hope. They arrived at 4 in the afternoon. They stayed for exactly 45 minutes. The kids opened their gifts in silence, their eyes glued to their phones. Brian's wife checked her watch every 5 minutes. Brian ate one cookie, standing by the door, like someone ready to bolt at any moment. "We have a family dinner," he finally said, "at her parents' house. We're already late. But this is also a family dinner," I wanted to say. I am also family, but the words got stuck in my throat. I just nodded. I just watched them leave. I just cleaned the table full of food I had prepared with so much love, food they had barely touched. That night, as I washed the dishes, I cried for the first time in years. Not a gentle cry. It was a deep sob, the kind that comes from the chest, the kind that hurts, because I had finally understood something I didn't want to accept. To them, I was an obligation, an errand, a quick stop on the way to where they really wanted to be. I remembered Mother's Day this year. Brian didn't come. He didn't even call. I received a text message at 11 o'clock at night. "Happy Mother's Day, Mom. Sorry I didn't call." It was a crazy day. Attached was a generic photo of flowers he had found on the internet. He hadn't even bothered to write something personal. But what hurt the most was seeing him post a photo with his mother-in-law the next day. A huge bouquet of roses. A lunch at an expensive restaurant. A long caption about how wonderful she was. About how grateful he was to have her in his life. About how much he admired her. I didn't exist in that world. I was invisible. I remembered all the times he asked to borrow money. Small amounts at first. $20 here, $50 there. Always with the promise that he'd pay me back soon. Always with some excuse about an emergency, an unexpected expense. Something that couldn't wait. And I always said yes. I always took the bills out of my purse. I always told him not to worry. That's what mothers were for. But the repayments never came. And the amounts grew. $100, $200, $500. Until one day, he asked me for $2,000 for an alleged car problem. I took out my savings. The money I had saved for years. Cutting expenses. Buying the cheaper brand. Denying myself small pleasures. I gave it to him without a second thought. Because he was my son. Because I trusted him. 2 weeks later, I saw him post photos on social media from a vacation at the beach. His wife in a new dress. The kids with expensive toys. Everyone smiling under the sundae with my money. With my sacrifices. With my dreams turned into their vacation. When I asked him about the car, he said he had already fixed it. That everything was fine. That he'd pay me back soon. That soon has been 8 months. And the money never came back. I remembered the time I was in the hospital. A year and a half ago. A silly fall in the kitchen. I hurt my hip and couldn't walk properly. The doctor said I needed to stay for observation for 2 days. I called Brian from the emergency room. Crying. Scared. Feeling older and more fragile than ever. He came that night. He stayed for 15 minutes. He told me he had an important meeting in the morning. That he couldn't miss it. That his wife would come visit me the next day. But she never came. No one came. I spent 2 days alone in that cold hospital room. Staring at the ceiling, listening to the nurse's footsteps in the hallway, wondering at what point I had become someone so easy to forget. When I left the hospital, I took a taxi home. I paid with the money I had saved for emergencies. I entered my empty house. I sat on my bed, and I wondered if it had really been worth sacrificing my whole life for a family that wasn't there when I needed them. I remembered the countless times I watched their kids, my grandchildren, those children who used to run to me with open arms and who now barely said hello. I picked them up from school when Brian and his wife had things to do. I fed them. I helped them with their homework. I played with them. I told them stories. But over time, the children started to change. They didn't want to stay with me anymore. They preferred to be at their own houses, with their video games and their iPads. When they came, they did so dragging their feet, with long faces, as if being with their grandmother was a punishment. And I knew it wasn't their fault. I knew someone had taught them to see me that way, as a burden, as someone boring, as someone who didn't matter. The last time I watched them, 3 months ago, the oldest one said something that broke my heart. "Grandma, why does your house smell weird? Why don't you have a big screen TV? Why is everything so old here?" His voice wasn't mean. It was simple curiosity. But behind those questions, I heard his parents' words. I heard the comments they made at home about me, about my way of life, about my house, about my life. I remembered the time I found a message on Brian's phone. It was an accident. He had left his phone on the table while he went to the bathroom. The screen lit up with a notification, and I, without thinking, glanced at it. It was a text from his wife. It said, "Have you talked to your mom about the house yet? We need to put pressure on her. She can't hold on to it forever. We need it more than she does." I felt the floor open up beneath me. It wasn't just a casual conversation. It was a plan. They had been planning this for a while, pressuring me, waiting for the right moment to take the only thing I had left. And now they were here, in my living room, after yelling at me to shut up, after treating me like I was nobody, looking at me with panicked eyes because I had finally said enough. The lawyer looked up from his papers. "Mrs. Davis," he began in a firm voice, "according to the documents I have here, this property is entirely in your name. There are no other owners. Is that correct?" "Yes," I replied. "That is correct." Brian took a step forward. His voice was trembling. "Mom, please, don't do this. We can talk. We can reach an agreement. You don't need a lawyer for this." But the lawyer continued, ignoring him. "And I understand that your son and his family have been living here without paying rent or contributing to the household expenses. Is that also correct?" I looked at Brian. I saw his face turn pale. "Yes," I said. "That is also correct." The silence that followed my words was thick, heavy, as if the very air had become difficult to breathe. Brian stared at me with wide eyes, as if he were seeing a stranger, as if the woman sitting in front of him couldn't possibly be his mother. The mother who always said yes. The mother who always forgave. The mother who always stepped aside. His wife finally found her voice. "This is ridiculous. You can't just kick us out like this. We have rights. We've lived here for 2 years. The lawyer didn't look up from his papers. Without a lease agreement, without documented payments, and with Mrs. Davis as the sole legal owner, you are technically occupants without title. The law is clear in these cases. Mom," Brian's voice was broken now, "are you really going to do this? After everything we've been through together?" I wanted to laugh, or cry, or both. After everything we've been through together, as if our memories were a two-way street, as if he had also been there for me in my difficult times, as if I hadn't spent the last few years completely alone while he built his life as if I didn't exist. I didn't answer. I just looked at him. And in that moment, something inside me finally settled into place, like when you solve a puzzle and the last piece fits perfectly. There were no more doubts, no more guilt, no more that voice in my head telling me that maybe I was exaggerating, that maybe they did love me in their own way, that maybe I was being selfish. No, I wasn't being selfish. I was being honest. For the first time in years, I was being completely honest with myself. I stood up from the armchair slowly. My knees protested a bit, as they always did, after I'd been sitting for a long time. I walked to the window and looked outside. The sun was beginning to set. The sky had that soft orange color I had always loved. The same clouds, the same sunset, but something had changed. I had changed. I remembered the conversation I had with myself 3 weeks ago. It was a night like any other. I was sitting in the kitchen, drinking tea, when I suddenly realized something. I realized I had been waiting for months, waiting for Brian to call me, waiting for him to invite me to something, waiting for him to ask how I was, waiting for him to remember that I existed. And that night, looking at my teacup, I understood that I could spend the rest of my life waiting. I could die waiting. And they would go on with their lives, probably not even noticing until they needed something from me, until they needed money, or the house, or some favor. That was the night I looked up the lawyer's number. I didn't call him yet. I just looked it up. Just made sure I had it handy. Just in case. Just in case things ever went too far. And today, they had gone too far. I turned from the window and looked Brian straight in the eye. For years, I have given you everything. Every cent I had. Every minute of my time. Every piece of my heart. And I never asked for anything in return. I just wanted you to see me. To remember that I exist, too. That I have feelings, too. That I also deserve respect. Brian opened his mouth to speak, but I held up my hand. I wasn't finished. But today you yelled at me to shut up. You told me this was for successful people to discuss. As if I was nobody. As if my opinion about my own house didn't matter. And in that moment, Brian, I understood something very clearly. I understood that to you. I am no longer your mother. I am a problem. I am something you have to solve so you can get on with your life. Tears started to stream down Brian's cheeks. No, Mom. That's not true. I love you. I've always loved you. But his wife interrupted him. Her voice was harsh, full of rage. This is emotional manipulation. You're using guilt to control us. We are your family. We have a right to be here. The lawyer finally spoke, in that calm voice he had maintained the whole time. Ma'am, with all due respect, the law doesn't work that way. The property belongs to Mrs. Davis. She has every right to decide who lives here and who does not. She shut her mouth, but her eyes were shooting daggers at me. I could see the hatred there, the resentment, and I realized something. She had never liked me. She hadn't even tried. To her, I had always been an obstacle, someone standing in the way between her and what she wanted. And what she wanted was this house, my house, the place where I had raised my son, the place where I had lived with my husband, the place where I kept all my memories. Mrs. Davis, the lawyer said, looking at me respectfully, do you wish for me to proceed with the eviction documents? Or would you prefer to give them a deadline to find another place? The question hung in the air. Brian looked at me with pleading eyes. His wife had crossed her arms and was looking away, as if none of this concerned her, as if she were the victim of a terrible injustice. I thought about giving them time, 30 days, 60 days, whatever. But then I remembered. I remembered every forgotten birthday, every broken promise, every time they left me alone, every unanswered text, every ignored call, every moment they made me feel invisible. And I remembered the words Brian had said to me just half an hour earlier. Be quiet. This is for successful people to discuss. I want them gone by tomorrow morning, I said in a firm voice. They can take their personal belongings. Everything else stays here because it is mine. Mom, no. Brian's voice broke. Please, give me a chance. I can change. We can fix this. His wife grabbed his arm. Don't beg her. Don't grovel. She's the one who's going to regret this. You'll see. But I wasn't listening anymore. I had made my decision. And for the first time in years, I didn't feel guilty. I didn't feel doubt. I just felt peace. A strange, new peace. But peace nonetheless. The lawyer began to pull more papers from his briefcase. I will need you to sign some documents acknowledging that you have been notified of the eviction. It's just a legal formality. We're not signing anything, Brian's wife said with contempt. Get your own lawyer if you want. This is going to court. The lawyer smiled slightly. It was a professional, calm smile. Ma'am, you can certainly do that if you wish, but I warn you that the law is entirely on my client's side. and legal proceedings will only make things more complicated and costly for you. I suggest you accept the terms and avoid further trouble." Brian sank onto the couch, his head in his hands. His wife remained standing, trembling with rage. I sat back down in my armchair and watched them. Watched them fall apart. Watched them lose control. Watched them realize they could no longer manipulate me. And I realized something else. I realized that all these years, I had held the power. I always had it. But I had chosen not to use it because I believed love was shown through sacrifice, through silence, through acceptance. I thought being a good mother meant letting them walk all over me, letting them use me, letting them forget me. But I was wrong. Being a good mother also meant teaching them consequences, teaching them respect, teaching them that actions have repercussions, and that you couldn't treat people like they didn't matter and expect them to always be there, waiting with open arms. The lawyer finished preparing the documents and placed them on the table. "These are the papers. You can read them over. You have until tomorrow at 10 o'clock in the morning to vacate the property. If you have not left by that time, I will have to proceed with the authorities." "You can't do this," Brian muttered without lifting his head. "You can't just throw us out on the street like this." "I'm not throwing you out on the street," I replied calmly. "I am removing you from my house. There is a difference. You have jobs. You have incomes. You have options. You can rent an apartment. You can ask her family for help. You can do what any responsible adult does when they need a place to live. But you can no longer live here for free while treating me as if I don't exist." Brian's wife pointed a finger at me. "You're selfish. A selfish, bitter old woman. You're going to ruin your own son's life over a temper tantrum." The lawyer stood up. "Ma'am, I'm going to ask you to remain respectful. Insults are not going to help this situation." She ignored him and continued to glare at me with hatred. "This isn't over. We're going to fight this. We're going to let everyone know what kind of mother you are, that you abandoned your son, that you kicked him out when he needed you most." I laughed. It was a short, bitter laugh. "When he needed me most. As if you ever needed me for anything other than money or favors. As if you ever thought of me as anything more than a useful tool. You can say whatever you want," I replied. "You can tell anyone whatever version you prefer. But the facts are the facts. And the facts are that you have lived in my house without paying a dime for 2 years. You have used my money. You have ignored me when it suited you. And today, you tried to sell my house without my consent. So go ahead, tell your story. I'll be here, in my house, at peace for the first time in years." Brian finally lifted his head. His eyes were red. "Mom, I'm sorry. I'm really sorry. I know I messed up. I know I've treated you badly. But give me a chance. One last chance to fix things." I looked at him. I saw the boy he had been. The boy who used to climb into my lap to have me read him stories. The boy who brought me flowers from the garden. The boy who told me that when he grew up, he was going to buy me a big house so I would never have to worry about anything. But that boy didn't exist anymore, and the man in front of me had made his choices. He had chosen his path, and that path didn't include me except when he needed me for something. "I'm sorry, Brian," I said finally, "but it's too late." Brian stared at me as if I had slapped him. His lips trembled, trying to form words that wouldn't come. His wife grabbed his arm hard, as if to pull him out of there before things got worse. But he didn't move. He just stood there, in the middle of my living room, his eyes filled with tears that finally began to fall. The lawyer put the documents back in his briefcase with precise movements. "Mrs. Davis, I'll leave my card here. If you have any questions or if any problems arise during the eviction process, do not hesitate to call me. I'll be available at any time." "Thank you, Mr. Kaplan," I replied. "I appreciate it very much." He nodded respectfully and headed for the door. But before leaving, he stopped and looked at Brian and his wife. "I recommend that you cooperate. It will be better for everyone." Then he left, closing the door softly behind him. The silence that remained was deafening. Brian finally sank back onto the couch. His wife paced back and forth in the living room, like a caged animal. I remained seated in my armchair, my hands in my lap, feeling how every second that passed gave me back a piece of myself that I had lost long ago. Then I heard a knock on the door. Soft but firm. All three of us turned to look. I wasn't expecting anyone else. The lawyer had just left. Brian and his wife exchanged confused glances. I got up slowly and walked to the door. When I opened it, I found an older man standing on the threshold. He looked to be about 75 years old, maybe more. He was wearing a wide-brimmed hat and a light-colored shirt. His face was weathered by the sun, full of wrinkles that spoke of a life lived outdoors. But what caught my attention the most were his eyes. They were a light green, almost transparent, and they looked at me with an intensity that made me take a step back. "Mrs. Eleanor Davis?" he asked in a deep but kind voice. "Yes, that's me," I replied, confused. "Can I help you with something?" The man took off his hat and held it in his hands. "Please allow me to introduce myself. My name is Arthur Miller, and I've come looking for my son. Your son." The words hung in the air for a moment before my brain processed them. I looked at him, not understanding. "I'm sorry, I think you have the wrong house. My son lives here, but he didn't move." He just stood there, looking at me with those eyes that seemed to see right through me. "Oh yes, ma'am. My son lives here. I've been looking for him for 38 years. I felt the floor move beneath my feet. 38 years. That number. That specific number. Brian was 38 years old. No. It couldn't be. It was impossible. It was a coincidence. It had to be. I turned towards the living room. Brian had stood up and was watching us from a distance. His face had lost all its color. His wife was also looking, but with a different expression. She seemed as confused as I was. "What are you talking about?" I asked the man, although a part of me already knew the answer. A part of me that had kept a secret for so long, I had almost convinced myself it didn't exist. Arthur Miller took a step forward. His voice was firm, but not aggressive. 39 years ago, I was in a relationship with a woman. We were in love. Or at least I thought we were. She got pregnant. I was happy. I wanted to marry her, to start a family. But she told me no. She told me she was already engaged to another man. A man with a better position, a better future. "No," I whispered, but my voice sounded weak even to me. He continued, ignoring my denial. "She told me the baby would be raised as that other man's son, that it was for the best, that I should forget her and get on with my life." I tried to fight. I tried to stay, but her family threatened me. They told me if I didn't leave town, they'd have me arrested. They'd invent charges. They'd destroy me. So I left. But I never forgot. I never stopped looking. Brian had walked towards us. He stopped halfway between the living room and the door. His voice came out hoarse. "What is this man saying, Mom?" I couldn't look at him. I couldn't look at either of them. The words I had held back for nearly 4 decades were pushing against my throat, wanting to come out. But there was also another part of me that wanted to close the door, to pretend this man had never arrived, to continue with the lie I had so carefully constructed. But it was too late. I was tired of lies, of secrets, of carrying burdens that weren't mine to bear. "It's true," I said finally. My voice was barely a whisper. "It's all true." The silence that followed was absolute. I could hear the ticking of the clock on the wall, the distant hum of the refrigerator, the sound of my own heart beating wildly in my ears. Brian took another step toward me. His voice trembled. "What's true? What is he talking about?" "Dad died 10 years ago. He was my father. Richard Davis was my father." Arthur Miller looked at me with eyes that mixed sadness and determination. "Tell him the truth, ma'am. He deserves to know it. He's waited long enough." I closed my eyes, took a deep breath, and finally, after so many years, I let the words out. "Richard was not your biological father, Brian. He knew. He always knew. But he raised you as his own son because he loved me, because he was a good man. Your biological father is this man, Arthur Miller." Brian's cry was heartbreaking. "No, that's a lie. You're lying." His wife had backed up against the wall, her hands over her mouth. Arthur Miller remained at the entrance, his hat still in his hands, looking at Brian with eyes full of tears. "I have proof," Arthur said in a broken voice. Letters your mother wrote to me before they separated us. Photographs. And if you want, we can do a DNA test. But I know the truth. I've been seeing it in your face since I got here. You have my eyes, my nose, the same jawline my father had. Brian turned to me with fury. Why? Why did you lie to me my whole life? Tears began to stream down my cheeks. Because I was scared. Because your father's family, Richard's family, was powerful. They had money. They had influence. And Arthur had nothing. He was a farmhand. A good man, but with no resources. My parents told me if I married him, they would disown me. That they would never know their grandchild. That we would be alone and unsupported. And you chose money? Brian's voice was full of contempt. You chose social position over the truth? I chose survival, I replied firmly. I was 19 years old, Brian. I was pregnant and terrified. I had no education, no way to support myself. Richard offered to marry me even though he knew the truth. He offered to give my child a name, a family, a future. And I accepted because it was the only option I had. Arthur stepped toward Brian. Son, I didn't find out about you until 5 years ago. I hired a private investigator. It took me all that time to find you. When I found out where you were, I wanted to reach out. But your mother asked me not to. She asked me to wait, to let you live your life in peace. And I agreed because I thought it was best for you. But now, after all these years, I needed to see you. I needed you to know the truth. Brian backed away, shaking his head. This can't be happening. This isn't real. His wife finally found her voice. This is perfect. Just perfect. It turns out my husband isn't even who he thought he was. What else are you going to reveal, Eleanor? What else have you been hiding? I looked at her directly. Everything you need to know, including the fact that the house, the money, everything Richard left was specifically for me, because he knew Brian wasn't his blood, but he loved him anyway. And in his will, he made it very clear that I was the sole heir, that this house was mine, that everything was mine to do with as I chose. Brian sank onto the couch again. His world was falling apart, and I could see it on his face. His entire life had been built on a lie, on a secret I had kept because I thought it was for the best. Arthur Miller approached Brian slowly. He knelt in front of him, despite his advanced age. His voice was soft. I know this is hard to process. I know you're angry and confused, but I want you to know something. I have loved you since before you were born. I have thought about you every day of my life. I have prayed for you. I have dreamed of this moment. And if you'll let me, I'd like to get to know you. I'd like to be a part of your life, even if it's late. Brian looked at him with tear-filled eyes. Why now? Why show up right now? Arthur glanced at me before answering. Because I found out what was happening. Because I heard you were treating your mother badly. And even though she and I didn't end up together, even though circumstances tore us apart, she is still the mother of my son. And nobody treats the mother of my son badly. The words fell on the living room like thunder. Brian froze. His wife's mouth opened, but no sound came out. And I, sitting in my armchair, finally understood why Arthur had shown up on this exact day. At this exact moment, Arthur stood up slowly, with the dignity of a man who has lived many years and learned to carry his burdens with grace. He pulled a yellowish envelope from his back pocket and placed it on the coffee table. These are letters. Letters your mother wrote to me almost 40 years ago. Letters I've kept all this time because they were the only thing I had left of her, and of you. Brian stared at the envelope as if it were dangerous. As if touching it would be admitting this was all real. His wife stepped forward and snatched the envelope before he could react. She tore it open with trembling hands and began to read. Her expression changed from skepticism to surprise, and finally to something resembling horror. These letters, she whispered, they're dated. They have postmarks. They're real. Arthur nodded. Yes, they're real. And if you need more proof, I brought this too. He pulled out another envelope, this one newer. It's a paternity test I had done 3 years ago. I hired an investigator who managed to get a DNA sample from Brian without him knowing. A glass he used at a restaurant. It was enough to confirm what I already knew in my heart. You spied on me? Brian's voice was somewhere between disbelief and rage. You took my DNA without my permission? Arthur looked at him calmly. Yes, I did. Because I needed to be sure before I walked into your life. I needed to have irrefutable proof. I didn't want to just be some old man with stories from the past. I wanted to be able to show you the truth. Brian took the envelope with the DNA results. His hands shook as he pulled out the documents. He read them once, twice. Then he let them fall onto the table as if they were burning. The room spun around me as I processed it all. The probabilities were clear. A 99.9% genetic match between Arthur Miller and Brian Davis. I watched my son as his reality disintegrated. Part of me wanted to run to him, to hug him, to tell him everything would be okay. But another part, the part that had awakened that afternoon, knew this had to happen, that I couldn't keep protecting the lies, that the truth, as painful as it was necessary. Arthur sat in the chair across from Brian. His voice was soft but firm. I know this is a lot to take in. I know your world just turned upside down, but I need you to understand something. I loved your mother. I loved her with everything I had. And when I found out she was pregnant, I wanted to be there. I wanted to be your father in every sense of the word. But I was robbed of that opportunity. Then why didn't you fight harder? Brian asked, his voice cracking. Why did you just leave? Because I was 20 years old and I had nothing. I worked in the fields earning $3 a day. Your mother's family had lawyers, influence, money. They threatened to accuse me of things I never did. They told me if I didn't leave, I'd end up in prison. And I, being young and naive, believed them. I left because I thought it was the only way to protect you and your mother. The tears were flowing freely down Brian's face now. And where have you been all these years? Why did you wait so long? Arthur took a deep breath. I went north. I worked every job I could find. I saved every penny. 15 years ago, I finally had enough money to hire an investigator. It took him 10 years to find you. And when he did, when I knew where you were, your mother asked me not to approach, to let you live your life, that there was a man, Richard, who had raised you as his son and who loved you. I didn't want to destroy that. So I agreed. I agreed to watch you from a distance, to know about you through reports, to see photographs, but to never get close. So why now? What changed? Arthur looked at me before answering. 3 months ago, I got a call. From your mother. She told me things had changed, that you had changed, that the relationship between you had deteriorated. She told me about the contempt, about the neglect, about how you were treating her, and she asked me to come. She said it was time for you to know the truth. Brian turned to me with accusing eyes. You called him? You planned all this? I nodded slowly. Yes, I called him. Because I reached a point where I realized the secret was doing more harm than good. Because I thought that maybe, if you knew the truth, you would understand some things. Understand why Richard never pushed you to be a certain way. Why he was always so patient with you. Because he loved you knowing you weren't his blood. He chose to love you. And you? Brian asked in a broken voice. Did you love me? Or did you just see me as a mistake? As a reminder of your sin? I got up from my armchair and walked to him. I knelt in front of my son, ignoring the pain in my knees. I took his face in my hands and made him look at me. I have loved you from the moment I knew you existed. Every sacrifice I made, every decision I took, was because I loved you. Maybe I didn't always make the right decisions. Maybe I should have told you the truth sooner. But never, ever doubt that I have loved you with every fiber of my being. Then why? Why this? Why kick me out now? Why bring this man here? Brian gestured toward Arthur. Why destroy everything? I sat down on the floor, too tired to keep kneeling, because I reached a point where I had to choose. Choose between continuing to be the mother who gets walked on, or being the woman who respects herself. And I chose the latter. Not to hurt you, Brian, but to save myself. Because if I kept going like that, one day I was going to wake up and realize there was nothing left of me, that I had given myself so completely to everyone else that I no longer existed. Brian's wife, who had been silent this whole time, finally spoke. Her voice was cold. "This is unbelievable. It turns out my husband is the son of a farmhand, that his whole life has been a lie. And we're just supposed to accept it?" Arthur looked at her with an intensity that made her shrink back. "Young lady, I didn't have money when I was younger. That's true. But I worked. I sacrificed. I built a life. Today, I own property. I have savings. I have a decent pension. I'm not rich, but I'm not poor either. And more importantly, I have dignity. I have honor. Things that money can't buy." She didn't respond. She just crossed her arms and looked away. Arthur pulled another paper from his pocket. "This is my will. I wanted you to see it, Brian. When I die, everything I have is yours. A house in town. $50,000 in savings. A piece of land I bought 10 years ago. It's not much compared to what some people have, but it's mine. And it's yours." "I don't want your money," Brian muttered. "I don't know you. I don't know who you are." "I'm your father," Arthur replied simply. "Maybe I didn't raise you. Maybe I wasn't there for your first steps or your first day of school, but my blood runs through your veins. And if you give me the chance, I'd like to get to know you. To know the man you've become." Brian's crying was quiet now. The tears were falling, but he was no longer making a sound. He just sat there on the couch, shoulders slumped, staring at the floor. I pushed myself up from the floor with difficulty. I felt tired, more tired than I had felt in years. But I also felt something else. I felt light, as if a giant weight had been lifted from my shoulders. I walked to the kitchen and put water on to boil. I needed tea. I needed something hot in my hands, something familiar and comforting. While I waited for the water to boil, I could hear the voices in the living room, Arthur speaking in a soft voice, Brian asking questions, his wife interrupting occasionally with sarcastic comments. I prepared 3 cups of tea and brought them into the living room on a tray. I offered one to Arthur, who accepted it with a grateful smile. I offered another to Brian, who took it without looking at me. And I left the third on the table, in case anyone else wanted it. I sat back down in my armchair and took a sip of my own tea. The hot liquid comforted me. It made me feel grounded, real. Arthur continued speaking. "I've lived for 38 years wondering what you'd be like. If you'd have my temper, my passion, my stubbornness. I've lived imagining conversations with you, teaching you things, sharing my life with you, and I know I can't get those years back. I know they're lost forever, but I hope we can build something now. Something real, something true. And if I don't want to?" Brian asked. "What if I prefer to keep living as I have been? Pretending you don't exist?" Arthur nodded slowly. "Then I will respect your decision. I'm not going to force anything, but I'll be here, waiting. In case you ever change your mind, I'll give you my number, my address, and when you're ready, if you're ever ready, come find me." He took a card from his wallet and left it on the table next to the letters and the DNA documents. It was a simple card, just his name, a phone number, and an address in a town 3 hours from here. The clock on the wall read 8 o'clock in the evening. Nearly 3 hours had passed since this all began. 3 hours that had changed everything. Arthur stood up slowly. "I think it's time for me to go. You've all had enough for one day." Brian didn't move. He didn't say anything. He just sat there, staring at the teacup in his hands as if it held the answers to the universe. Arthur walked to the door. I followed him. Before he left, he turned to me. "Thank you, Eleanor. I know this wasn't easy, but you did the right thing." "Did I?" I asked. "I'm not even sure what the right thing is anymore." "The right thing is the truth," he replied. "It's always the truth." And he closed the door behind him. When Arthur left, the house was plunged into a silence so thick you could almost touch it. Brian was still on the couch, the cold teacup between his hands. His wife had gone upstairs without a word. I could hear her furious footsteps above my head as she moved things, probably starting to pack. I sat back down in my armchair and watched my son. He was no longer the confident, arrogant man from a few hours ago. He was someone broken, lost, and for a moment, I felt the urge to take it all back, to tell him he could stay, that we could forget all this. But then I remembered his words. Be quiet. This is for successful people to discuss. And I knew I couldn't go back. Brian finally looked up. Did Dad know? Did Richard know the whole time? Yes, I replied. He knew before we even got married. I told him because I didn't want to start our marriage with lies. And he, being the man he was, told me it didn't matter, that he would love you as his own because he loved me. And he did love me. With all his heart, he loved you more than anything in this world. That's why he left everything to you when he died. His last name, his teachings, his legacy. Everything except this house, because he knew I would need it. Brian put the cup down on the table. Why did you never tell me? Because I was afraid. Afraid you would hate me. Afraid you'd feel like your life had been a lie. Afraid of losing you. And now you lose me anyway, he said bitterly. No, Brian. You lost me a long time ago. Today, I'm just putting a name to what already happened. He stood up and walked to the window. Outside, night had completely fallen. The streetlights cast long shadows on the lawn. What am I supposed to do now? My father isn't my father. My mother is kicking me out of her house. My wife is furious. I don't know who I am. You are Brian Davis, the man Richard raised with love, the man who has a chance to start over, to be better, to learn from his mistakes. He turned to me, his eyes full of pain. Do you really think I'm that bad? That terrible? I think you got lost along the way. I think you let ambition and pressure pull you away from what really matters. I think you forgot where you came from, but I also think there's still time to change. If you want to. His wife came down the stairs with a suitcase in each hand. Her face was a mask of contained fury. I'm ready. Let's go. I'm not spending another minute in this house. Brian didn't move. I need to think. I need to process all this. You can process in a hotel, she replied coldly. Or at your new father's house. The farmhand. Maybe he has room for us. Don't talk about him like that, I said firmly. Arthur is a good man. Hard-working, honest. More than I can say for some. She shot me a venomous look. You have no right to judge anyone. You, who lied to your son his entire life. You, who are kicking us out like we're trash. I'm kicking you out because you treated me like trash first. Because you moved into my house without paying. Because you used my generosity. Because you planned to sell it without my consent. I am not the victim you're trying to paint me as. Brian finally moved. He took one of the suitcases from his wife. Let's go. I need air. I need space. They walked to the door. He stopped on the threshold and looked at me one last time. I don't know if I can ever forgive you for this. The words hurt, but not as much as I thought they would. I'm not asking for forgiveness, Brian. I'm asking you to understand. And when you're ready, if you're ever ready, I'll be here. But not as the mother who lets herself be walked on, but as the woman who finally learned to value herself. They left without another word. I heard the car engine start. I watched the taillights drive down the street until they disappeared. And then, for the first time in years, I was completely alone in my house, in my space, in my life. I walked through each room slowly. I touched the walls. I looked at the photographs. I remembered every moment I had lived within these four walls. The good and the bad, the laughter and the tears. Richard making breakfast in the kitchen. A young Brian running down the hall. The family dinners that were once so full of love. But I also remembered the last few years. The emptiness, the loneliness, the feeling of being invisible in my own home. And I knew I had made the right decision. It had been painful. It had been hard. But it had been necessary. I got ready for bed that night with a strange feeling. It wasn't happiness, exactly. But it wasn't sadness either. It was peace. A peace I hadn't felt in a long, long time. I lay down in my bed, under the same covers where I had slept with Richard, and for the first time in years, I slept through the entire night without waking up, without worries, without guilt. Tomorrow would be another day, a day to start over, a day to rebuild, a day to live the life I deserved, a life where my voice mattered, where my decisions counted, where I existed not just as a mother, but as Eleanor, as a woman, as a person. And that, after all, was enough. I woke up early the next morning. The sun was just beginning to peek through the window, painting my room in golden hues. I lay in bed for a few minutes, enjoying the silence. A silence that wasn't empty or heavy. It was my own, chosen, calm. I got up slowly and went to the kitchen. I made coffee just for myself. I didn't have to calculate if it was enough for 3 or 4 people. I didn't have to worry if someone else liked it lighter or stronger. I just made it to my taste. And when I sat down to drink it, looking out the window at the garden I loved so much, I felt something I hadn't felt in years. I felt that this house was truly mine. I spent the morning cleaning, not because I had to, but because I wanted to. I wanted to erase the traces of those 2 years when my house hadn't been my own. I washed the curtains. I changed the sheets on the beds. I opened all the windows to let the fresh air in. The house was breathing again, and so was I. Mid-morning, the phone rang. It was Mr. Kaplan, the lawyer. "Mrs. Davis, I'm calling to confirm that the eviction was completed as agreed. Did you have any problems?" "None," I replied. "They left last night. I'm glad to hear it, and I want to inform you that I've prepared some additional documents, protection measures in case they try to return or cause you trouble. Is it all right if I stop by this afternoon to review them with you?" "Yes, please. I'll expect you at 4. I hung up and continued with my day. I made a simple lunch, just for me. I ate slowly, savoring every bite, without rushing, without having to listen to conversations about money or plans that didn't include me. Just me, my food, and the comforting silence of my home. At 4 o'clock sharp, the doorbell rang. It was Mr. Kaplan. Punctual as always, he had his briefcase and a serious but kind expression. He came in, and we sat in the living room. "I brought several documents," he began. "First, a temporary restraining order. If your son or daughter-in-law try to approach you without your consent or threaten you in any way, this will legally protect you. Second, I've updated your will to reflect your current wishes. And third, I prepared a notarized statement regarding the ownership of the house, so there will be no legal doubts in the future." I reviewed each document carefully. The lawyer explained every clause, every detail. Everything was in order. Everything protected my interests. For the first time in a long time, I felt like someone was on my side. Not because I owed them anything, not because they expected anything in return, but because it was the right thing to do. "There's something else I'd like to propose," the lawyer said, as he put the signed documents away. "I know a social worker, an excellent woman who helps seniors create support networks, to connect with the community, to not feel alone. If you're interested, I can give you her contact information." I looked at my hands, wrinkled from years and work. A few days ago, I would have said no. I would have thought that asking someone for help was admitting weakness, that I had to be able to do it all myself. But today was different. Today, I understood that asking for help wasn't weakness. It was intelligence. "Yes," I replied. "I would like that contact." The lawyer smiled. "I can see the change in you, Mrs. Davis. You seem lighter, more at peace. I feel lighter, as if I'd been carrying rocks in my pockets for years and finally gave myself permission to let them go." He stood up to leave, but before he reached the door, he stopped. "Allow me to say something. I've worked with many families over the years. I've seen many cases of emotional and financial abuse towards seniors. And what you did yesterday required extraordinary courage. Not everyone has the strength to stand up for themselves, especially against their own children. You should be proud." His words touched me deeply. "Thank you," I whispered. "Thank you for helping me." When he left, I stood in the living room. The afternoon light streamed through the windows, creating patterns on the hardwood floor. I sat in my armchair and closed my eyes. I took a deep breath, and for the first time in a long time, I didn't feel that weight in my chest, that constant anxiety, that fear of not being enough. The phone rang again. This time it was a number I didn't recognize. I hesitated before answering, but finally, I did. "Mrs. Eleanor?" It was Arthur Miller's voice. "I hope I'm not bothering you. I just wanted to know how you were, how you'd slept." His concern surprised me. "Fine," I replied. "Better than I expected, actually. I'm glad to hear that. And Brian? Do you know anything about him?" "He left last night. I haven't heard from him since." There was a silence on the other end of the line. Then Arthur spoke softly. "I know this is hard for you. I know I'm part of the reason everything exploded. And I want you to know, I didn't come to cause trouble. I just wanted him to know the truth." "You did the right thing," I replied. "The truth is always better than a lie, even when it hurts. Can I ask you something?" His voice sounded hesitant. "After all these years, after everything that happened, do you hate me? For what we were?" The question took me by surprise. I thought about the Arthur from almost 40 years ago, the young farmhand who made me laugh, who made me feel alive, who promised me a future that never came to be. "No," I replied finally. "I don't hate you. I never hated you. I just did what I thought I had to do at the time. And you did the same. We were young, scared, doing the best we could with what we had. I don't hate you either," he said. "And I want you to know that Richard was a good man, a better man than me in many ways. He gave Brian stability, a family, a home, things I couldn't offer back then. He gave him love," I added. "He gave him a father. And that's more valuable than anything else." We talked a little longer, about the past, about what our lives had been like. Arthur told me about his years up north, the hard work, the loneliness, how he had built a modest but dignified life, how he had never married because he could never forget me, could never forget the son he never knew. When we hung up, I sat with the phone in my hand, thinking about all the decisions I had made, all the paths I hadn't taken, all the versions of my life that could have been but never were. But this was my life, this one, the one I had lived, with its mistakes and its triumphs, with its pain and its joy. And for the first time, I was okay with it. I was at peace with the decisions I had made, because all of them, even the wrong ones, had brought me here. To this moment, to this 69-year-old woman sitting in her house, finally free. That night, I made a special dinner, just for me. I set the table with the good tablecloth. I lit a candle. I poured a glass of wine I had been saving for a special occasion. And as I ate, alone but not lonely, I understood something fundamental. I didn't need anyone to validate me. I didn't need anyone to tell me I had value. I didn't need to wait for my family to see me in order to exist. I existed. I mattered. I had a right to take up space in this world, to have opinions, to defend what was mine, to say no, to say enough. And that, finally, was enough. 3 weeks passed since that afternoon that changed everything. 3 weeks in which my house truly became mine again. Every morning I woke up without that knot in my stomach, without that weight pressing on my chest. I had started doing small things for myself, things that once seemed impossible or selfish. I joined the book club at the library. I met other women my age, women with their own stories, their own battles. We met on Tuesday afternoons and talked about books, yes, but also about life, about the past, about the present. And for the first time in years, I had friends, people who sought me out because they wanted to see me, not because they needed something from me. One of them, Brenda, became a special companion. She was a 72-year-old woman, a widow like me, with a contagious laugh and a wisdom that came from a life fully lived. She told me she had also gone through something similar with her family, that she'd also had to learn to set boundaries, to say enough. It's funny, she told me one Tuesday over coffee after our meeting. We spend our whole lives taking care of others, being mothers, wives, grandmothers, and we forget that we're also people, that we also have dreams, needs, limits. Her words resonated with me. She was right. I had spent 69 years defining myself by my relationships, by what I was to others. And I had forgotten who I was, just me. I started restoring the house as I had always wanted. I painted the living room walls a soft cream color that made me feel at peace. I bought new plants for the garden. I hired a young man from the neighborhood to help me with the repairs I had been putting off. The house began to feel alive again, as if it too had been waiting for this moment to breathe. Brian hadn't called, not once in 3 weeks. Part of me expected him to show up at the door, apologizing. wanting to talk. But another part, the new part that was growing inside me, understood that maybe he needed time, or maybe he would never call. And I had to be okay with both possibilities. One Thursday afternoon, as I was watering the plants in the garden, I saw a car pull up in front of my house. My heart leaped, thinking it might be Brian. But when the door opened, it was Arthur who got out. He was carrying a box and had a cautious expression on his face. "I hope I'm not bothering you," he said as he approached. "I just wanted to bring you this." He opened the box. Inside were photographs. Lots of photographs. All of Brian. Some were recent, taken from a distance. Others were older, printed from the internet or social media. I realized that Arthur had been following his son's life for years, watching from the shadows. Saving every scrap of evidence of his existence, tears began to roll down my cheeks, and I couldn't stop them. "Arthur, this is—" "I know," he interrupted gently. "It's pathetic. An old man hoarding pictures of a son he doesn't know. But it was all I had. The only way I could be part of his life." I invited him in. I made tea, and we sat in the living room. We spent hours looking at the photographs together. I told him stories from each stage. Arthur listened, his eyes shining, absorbing every detail like water in a desert. "He was 6 here," I said, pointing to a photo of Brian on his first day of school. "He was so nervous he didn't want to go. Richard had to carry him to the car." "Did he cry?" "No, he acted tough. But when I came back to pick him up, he ran to me and hugged me so hard I could barely breathe. He slept in our bed that night because he didn't want to be alone." Arthur touched the photograph with trembling fingers. "I missed all of that, all those moments." "I'm sorry," I whispered. "I'm sorry things happened the way they did." We sat in silence for a moment. Then Arthur took an envelope from his pocket. "This is for you. You don't have to open it now, but when you're ready, read what's inside." After he left, I opened the envelope. Inside was a letter, handwritten, in careful, clear script. It was long, several pages. Arthur told me his whole life. Everything he had done, everything he had felt. It was like reading a ghost's diary, someone who had been there all along, but invisible. At the end of the letter, he had written something that broke my heart and healed it at the same time. "I don't blame you for the decisions you made. You did what you thought was best for our son. And even though it hurts, all that we lost, I am also grateful that Brian had a mother like you, a mother who loved him enough to sacrifice her own happiness for his well-being." I put the letter in my drawer, along with my other precious things. That night, before sleeping, I let myself cry, not out of pity, not out of regret, but for everything that was and everything that could have been, for the lives we lived and the ones we didn't, for the decisions we made and their consequences. The next morning, the doorbell rang early. When I opened the door, I was met with a surprise. It was my grandchildren, Brian's 2 children, but they were alone, without their parents. "Grandma," the oldest one said, "Mom doesn't know we're here. We ran away." "Well, we took the bus. We wanted to see you." My heart swelled. I hugged them tight, feeling their small bodies against mine. They smelled like soap and youth, like innocence, like hope. I brought them inside. I made hot chocolate and cookies. We sat in the kitchen, and they told me what the last 3 weeks had been like, how their parents argued all the time, how their dad would just stare into space for hours, how their mom was constantly angry. "Dad cries at night," the younger one said in a small voice. "He says your name in his sleep." The words hurt, but not as much as they would have before, because now I understood that Brian's pain was his own to process, that I couldn't save him from the consequences of his actions, that this too was a form of love, letting him face his reality. We spent the whole morning together. We played in the garden. We read stories. We talked about school and their friends, and for the first time in a long time, I saw them truly happy, without the tension they always carried, without that invisible weight. When it was time to take them back, I called Brian. He answered on the 3rd ring. His voice sounded tired. "The kids are with me. They're fine. But you need to come get them." There was a long silence. Then I heard his broken voice. Can I come up when I get there? Can we talk?" I thought about saying no, about maintaining my boundaries. But then I looked at my grandchildren, who were watching me with hopeful eyes, and I knew I had to try. Not for me, not for Brian, but for them. Yes, I replied. We can talk. When I hung up, Brenda, who had come to visit and had met the children, took my hand. You're doing the right thing. Giving him a chance to talk doesn't mean you're going to let him walk all over you again. It means you're strong enough to listen. And that, my dear Eleanor, is true power. Half an hour later, Brian arrived. He looked different, thinner, deep dark circles under his eyes, his hair uncombed. When he saw the children, he hugged them as if he hadn't seen them in years. They clung to him. And I saw something in his eyes I hadn't seen in a long time. I saw remorse. I saw real pain. I saw someone who was finally waking up. The children got in the car after saying goodbye to me, with long hugs and promises to come back soon. Brian stood on the doorstep, his hands in his pockets, staring at the ground like a child waiting to be scolded. Do you want to come in? I asked. He nodded without speaking. We went into the house and sat in the living room, the same place where everything had exploded 3 weeks ago, but now the atmosphere was different, cleaner, lighter. The house breathed peace. Brian looked around, noticing the changes. You painted. Yes. And I changed several other things. This is my house now, truly mine. It looks good. You look good too. I stayed silent, waiting. I knew he had come to say something. And this time, I wasn't going to fill the silence for him. I wasn't going to make it easy. If he wanted to talk, he would have to find the words himself. I've been thinking a lot, he finally began, about everything that happened, about the things I said, about how I treated you. And, Mom, you were right, about everything. His words surprised me. I had expected excuses, justifications, but not this, not such a direct admission. I lost my way, he continued, his voice breaking. I got carried away by ambition, by wanting to have more, by trying to impress my wife and her family, and in the process, I forgot what was most important. I forgot you. I forgot everything you did for me, everything you sacrificed. Tears began to roll down his face. When you told me Arthur was my biological father, my first instinct was to hate you for lying. But then I started to think, to remember. And I realized something. Dad, Richard, he loved me more than anything in this world. And he had no obligation to. He chose to love me. He chose to be my father. And that makes him more of a father than any blood tie. I nodded slowly. He loved you with every fiber of his being. And so did you, Brian said, looking me in the eyes. So did you. You did what you thought was best for me. You made hard choices to give me a better life, and I paid you back with contempt, with neglect, with ingratitude. He dropped to his knees in front of me. His body shook with deep sobs. Forgive me. Mom, please, forgive me. I know I don't deserve it. I know I hurt you in unforgivable ways. But I'm begging you, give me a chance to be better, to be the son you deserve. I placed my hands on his head. I felt his pain, his regret, and I knew it was real. This wasn't manipulation. It wasn't a strategy to get the house or money back. This was a broken man, finally seeing the truth of what he had done. Brian, I said softly, I forgive you. But you need to understand something. Forgiving you doesn't mean things go back to the way they were. It doesn't mean you can move back in, or that I'm going to let you treat me the way you did. I know, he whispered. I know, and I accept that. I've learned to value myself, to put myself first, and I'm not giving that up, not for you, not for anyone. I'm not asking you to. I'm just asking you to let me try to be better, try to rebuild our relationship, slowly, with respect, with boundaries, the way you decide. I looked at him. I saw my son. But I also saw a man who was finally growing up, who was finally learning, and I decided to give him that chance. Not because he deserved it, but because I was strong enough to risk trusting again. We can try, I said, but with conditions. No living here. No asking for money. No making decisions about my life without consulting me. And if you ever disrespect me again, even once, we're done. Understood? Understood, he replied quickly. I promise. And your wife? What does she think about all this? Brian looked down. We separated 2 weeks ago. She couldn't accept the Arthur thing. She couldn't accept that I wasn't the man she thought she knew. And honestly, I couldn't be with someone who treated you with so much contempt anymore. I was surprised by the news, but not saddened. I pitied her. I couldn't deny that. But I also knew it was for the best. For him, for the children, for everyone. And the kids? I asked. They're with me. We have a small apartment. Nothing fancy. But it's ours. I'm learning to cook, to clean, to be a real father. Not just the one who brings in the money. I'm glad to hear that. We sat in silence for a moment. Then Brian spoke again. Have you seen Arthur? Yes. He came by a few days ago. He brought me photographs, pictures of you he'd been collecting all these years. Brian wiped his tears. I've seen him too. I went to visit him last week, at his house in town. And how did it go? It was a strange, weird, but good, healing. He told me stories about his life, about my mother, about you, about how he loved you. And I understood something. I understood that we all made mistakes. You, him, Richard, me. We all just did the best we could with what we had. That's the truest thing there is, I replied. We all do the best we can. And when we know better, we do better. Brian stood up and sat on the couch. Can I ask you something? Of course. Are you happy now? Alone, I mean. Are you really happy? I thought about the question. About my newly painted house. About my friends from the book club. About my quiet mornings with coffee and silence. About my garden, blooming. About my life, finally being mine. Yes, I replied. I am happy. Not in the way I imagined I would be. Not in the way I was taught I should be. But yes, I'm happy. I'm glad to hear that, he said with a sad smile. I really am. We talked for a while longer. About the kids. About his plans. About how he was managing life on his own. It was a different conversation. No tension. No hidden agendas. Just a mother and her son, talking in a way they hadn't in years. When he left, I hugged him at the door. It was a real hug. Sincere. Full of hope, but also caution. Because I had learned. I had learned that love doesn't mean sacrificing yourself into non-existence. That boundaries aren't walls, they're bridges. And that saying no is also an act of love. That night, I sat in my armchair with a cup of tea. I looked at the photographs on the wall. Richard, smiling. Brian as a child. Moments frozen in time from a life that was. But I also looked at the new things. The plants. The painted walls. The books from the club. The signs of the life, that is. And I realized something fundamental. I realized my story hadn't ended. That at 69 years old, I was still writing new chapters. I was still discovering who I was. I was still learning to live. I thought about all the women who were going through the same thing I had. Invisible women. Forgotten women. Women who gave and gave until there was nothing left of them. And I wanted to tell them something. I wanted to tell them that it's never too late. That you can always start over. That self-love is not selfishness. That boundaries are not cruelty. That standing up for yourself is not betrayal. I wanted to tell them that they, too, deserve to exist. That their voices also matter. That their dreams also count. That you don't have to wait for permission to live your own life. I stood up and walked to the window. Outside, the night was full of stars. The same sky I had looked at my whole life, but which I now saw with different eyes. Eyes that had seen pain, but also rebirth. Eyes that had cried, but also smiled. Eyes that had finally learned to see my own worth. And I wondered something. I wondered if maybe, just maybe, my story could help someone else. If someone else would hear what I lived through and realize they are not alone, that their pain is valid, that their decision to defend themselves is right. that their life also matters. Because in the end, that's what we're all looking for. To matter, to be seen, to be valued, not for what we do for others, but for who we are, simply for existing. And I, Eleanor Davis, at 69 years old, had finally learned that lesson. I had finally found myself. And though the road was painful, though I had to lose so much to gain myself, I wouldn't change a thing. Because for the first time in my life, I was completely free. And you, reading this, have you ever felt like they were trying to erase you from your own story? Have you ever had to choose between the love of others and love for yourself? If so, I want you to know that you are not alone, that your story matters, that your voice deserves to be heard, and that it is never, ever too late to start over.